There's a house at the end of my street, an old, decrepit building that's been abandoned for as long as I can remember. No one knows who used to live there, and most people in town prefer to avoid talking about it. But like all small towns, there are always rumors. Whispered stories passed down from one generation to the next. They say the house is cursed, that anyone who steps foot inside never comes out the same. Some say they've seen strange lights flickering in the windows at night, even though the house has been empty for years. Others claim to have heard voices, distant and faint, calling out from the darkness. I never believed the stories. I've always been a skeptic, the kind of person who needs hard evidence before accepting anything out of the ordinary. So when my friend suggested we explore the house on a dare, I didn't hesitate. It was just an old building after all. What was there to be afraid of? We went on a Friday night, the kind of cold, crisp evening where the air feels electric with the promise of something about to happen. There were 5 of us, me, Jake, Emily, Tom and Sarah, and we were all eager for an adventure. The walk to the house was longer than I expected, the road winding through dense woods that seemed to close in around us the farther we went. The house loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the night sky. It was larger than I had imagined, with gnarled trees and overgrown bushes choking the front yard. The front door was ajar, creaking on its rusty hinges as the wind pushed it back and forth. We stepped inside cautiously, our flashlights sweeping across the dusty floorboards and peeling wallpaper. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, but there was something else too, a faint, acrid odor that made my stomach turn. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft creak of the floorboards beneath our feet. We explored room by room, finding nothing but broken furniture and shattered windows. It was disappointing, really. I had expected more from a place with such a notorious reputation. But then we found the basement. The door was hidden behind a bookshelf in the living room, barely visible unless you knew where to look. It was locked, but Tom, ever the resourceful one, managed to pry it open with a crowbar he had brought along. The air inside the basement was colder than the rest of the house, and a sense of foreboding settled over us as we descended the narrow stairs. The flashlight beams flickered erratically, casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. At the bottom of the stairs, we found ourselves in a large, empty room. The walls were lined with strange symbols, drawn in what looked like dried blood. Suddenly, the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut with a deafening bang, plunging us into darkness. Panic set in immediately. Jake and Emily screamed, scrambling for the stairs, but no matter how hard we pushed, the door wouldn't budge. We were trapped. Then came the voices. Soft at first, almost like a whisper, carried on the wind, but growing louder and more insistent. They were all around us, echoing off the walls, calling our names in voices that were both familiar and terrifying. We huddled together, our hearts pounding in our chests, as the voices grew louder and more frantic. The air grew thick with the smell of rot and decay, and the symbols on the walls seemed to glow with a faint, malevolent light. And then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The voices faded into nothing, and the door at the top of the stairs creaked open. We didn't waste any time. We ran, our footsteps echoing through the empty house as we fled into the night. None of us ever spoke about what happened in that basement. As we drove away, I glanced back at the house one last time. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something. A figure standing in the doorway watching us leave. But when I blinked, it was gone. We never spoke about that night again. We all knew something had followed us out of that house, but none of us wanted to admit it. The nightmares started soon after. Whispers in the dark, cold touches in the middle of the night, and the feeling of always being watched. Story 2. the uninvited guest. It was supposed to be a simple reunion, an evening of laughter and reminiscence. Little did we know it would turn into a living nightmare. My name is Emily, and the events of that fateful night still haunt my every waking moment. It was a Friday evening when I decided to host a small get-together at my home. My best friends, Sarah, Mike and Claire, were all coming over, along with a new acquaintance, Jordan, who had recently joined our social circle. I didn't know him well, but Sarah had vouched for him. He was a quiet man, polite but distant, with an air of mystery around him that intrigued and unnerved me in equal measure. The dinner went smoothly, or at least it started that way. The conversation flowed easily, and the clinking of wine glasses filled the air. Jordan, however, seemed more withdrawn than usual. He barely spoke, his eyes darting around the room as if he was waiting for something. I tried not to let it bother me, but an uneasy feeling began to creep into my chest. It wasn't until after dessert that things began to spiral. Jordan abruptly stood up from his seat, muttering something under his breath that I couldn't quite catch. Before anyone could ask what was wrong, he left the room, his footsteps heavy as they echoed through the hallway. The rest of us sat there in stunned silence, unsure of what had just happened. I decided to check on him, hoping to diffuse whatever tension had built up. I found him standing by the window in the living room, staring out into the darkness. "Jordan?" I called softly, not wanting to startle him. He didn't respond, but I could see the rigid tension in his body. I approached slowly, keeping my voice gentle. "Are you okay? You seemed a bit..." Before I could finish my sentence, he turned around sharply, his eyes wide and frantic. "They're watching us," he whispered. His voice was barely audible, but the fear in his tone was unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat. "Who's watching us?" He shook his head, his hands trembling as he pointed towards the window. "They know we're here. We need to leave. Now." A chill ran down my spine. I glanced out the window, but all I saw was the dense woods that surrounded my property. "Jordan, there's no one out there. It's just your imagination." But he wasn't listening. He grabbed his coat and bolted for the front door, leaving it wide open as he disappeared into the night. I stood there, stunned and confused, my mind racing to make sense of his bizarre behavior. The others joined me in the living room, concern etched on their faces. We debated whether or not to go after him, but ultimately decided to give him space, hoping he would calm down and come back on his own. As the night wore on, the atmosphere grew heavier, as if the house itself had absorbed Jordan's fear. We tried to continue with our evening, but the unease was palpable. The shadows seemed to grow longer, and every creak of the old floorboards made us jump. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. Sarah, Mike, and Claire left, leaving me alone in the house. I should have felt relief, but instead, a deep sense of dread settled over me. I locked all the doors and double-checked the windows before heading upstairs to my bedroom. Sleep did not come easily that night. My mind replayed the evening's events over and over, each time focusing on Jordan's last words. "They're watching us." I told myself it was nonsense, that he was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. At some point in the early hours of the morning, I was jolted awake by a loud noise outside. It sounded like footsteps, heavy and deliberate, circling the house. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up in bed, straining to hear through the silence that followed. Then came the whispering. Faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but growing louder and more distinct. It was as if a group of people were standing just outside my window, murmuring in hushed tones, I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the sound was unmistakably human. I scrambled out of bed and rushed to the window, pulling back the curtains with trembling hands. But when I looked out, there was no one there. The yard was empty, bathed in the pale light of the moon. The woods beyond stood silent and still, as if the entire world had gone to sleep. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, a product of my overactive imagination fueled by Jordan's strange behavior. But deep down, I knew something was out there, watching, waiting. The next few days were a blur. I didn't see or hear from Jordan, and neither did anyone else. He had vanished without a trace, leaving behind more questions than answers. The police were called, and they searched the area, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had simply disappeared into thin air. The whispers, however, did not stop. Every night, without fail, they returned, growing louder and more insistent. They were always just beyond my reach, never clear enough to understand, but always close enough to send chills down my spine. I don't know what happened to Jordan, and I don't know who or what was watching us that night. Story 3. The Reflection. It began with a simple purchase, a vintage mirror from a flea market, its ornate frame hinting at a storied past. I was drawn to its elegance, the way it caught the light just right, casting a warm glow in my otherwise plain apartment. As soon as I hung it in my living room, I felt an inexplicable sense of satisfaction. It was beautiful and unique, a conversation starter that I hoped would impress my friends. But soon after, strange occurrences began to unfold. At first, it was subtle. I'd catch glimpses of movement in the mirror's reflection when no one else was in the room. A fleeting shadow darting behind me, a whisper of motion that sent shivers down my spine. I dismissed it as my imagination, perhaps a trick of the light, or the result of my overactive mind. Then the dreams started. Every night, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, staring into its depths as darkness swirled around me. I would wake in a cold sweat, the echo of a soft voice lingering in my ears. "Help me," it would say, haunting yet soft, like a breeze rustling through the trees. I felt compelled to understand what was happening, to uncover the mystery that seemed to be seeping into my reality. One evening, I decided to investigate the mirror's origins. I spent hours online searching for anything related to its design or history. After much digging, I stumbled across a local legend about a woman named Clara, who had once owned a similar mirror. According to the tale, Clara had been an artist with a dark obsession. She claimed her mirror allowed her to see the truth hidden within herself. But one night, in a fit of madness, she vanished, leaving behind her unfinished paintings and an unsettling aura. But then one night, as I prepared for bed, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. I turned to face the mirror, and for the first time I saw her. Clara's reflection stared back at me, her expression twisted in agony. My heart raced as I realized that the voice I had been hearing was hers. I stumbled backward, gasping for breath, feeling as if I had been punched in the gut. "Help me!" she cried, her voice a desperate whisper echoing in my mind. "You must free me!" My thoughts raced. What did she want? Why was she trapped? I felt an overwhelming urge to help her, to understand what bound her to the mirror. I approached slowly, each step fueled by a mix of dread and curiosity. As I stood before her reflection, I felt an electric pull, as if she were reaching out to me through the glass. That night, I decided to confront whatever dark force resided within the mirror. I gathered candles and set them up around my living room, creating an eerie ambience. As the flickering light danced against the glass, I began to speak to Clara, trying to coax her spirit into revealing the truth. "What happened to you?" I asked, voice trembling. The room grew colder, the shadows deepening. For a moment, nothing happened. But then the temperature dropped even more, and the candles flickered violently. Clara's reflection distorted, her face twisted in anguish as she pointed toward the mirror's surface. "You must let me out!" she screamed, her voice now filled with rage. In that moment, panic seized me. I had gone too far. I stepped back, breaking the connection, and the mirror returned to its normal state. The chilling realization hit me. I had been drawn into something far beyond my comprehension. As the days passed, the incidents intensified. I started seeing her more frequently, not just in the mirror, but in my peripheral vision, her haunting figure lingering just out of sight. I became paranoid, convinced that Clara was somehow manipulating my reality, her desire for freedom consuming my thoughts. Desperate to escape this nightmare, I decided to cover the mirror. I draped a heavy blanket over it, hoping that would sever the connection. For a brief moment, I felt relief, as if a weight had been lifted. But that night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "Help me! You're the only one who can..." No matter how hard I tried to ignore her, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. I became a prisoner in my own home, living in fear of the dark. I stopped inviting friends over, fearing they would experience Clara's wrath too. Finally, I could take it no longer. I resolved to destroy the mirror, to rid myself of the curse that had taken over my life. With trembling hands, I uncovered it, my heart racing as I saw Clara's reflection, her eyes filled with desperation. As I raised a hammer above my head, ready to shatter the glass, Clara's reflection transformed into a mask of fury. "No!" she screamed. "You will regret this!" The force of her rage surged through me, and I dropped the hammer, staggering back. The lights flickered, and suddenly the room plunged into darkness. I felt a presence rush toward me, cold and suffocating, as if the very essence of despair enveloped me. When I regained my senses, I was standing in front of the mirror, but the reflection was different. Clara was gone, and in her place was my own face, pale and hollow. I realized then that I had become the next victim of the mirror, trapped in an endless cycle of despair. No one would hear my cries. No one would know what I had done. I was now the keeper of the mirror, bound to its darkness forever. And somewhere in the shadows, Clara smiled, knowing she had finally found a companion in her eternal prison.